It's widely believed and widely claimed on the internet that people in ancient and medieval times thought of runes as magical sigils and used them as magical sigils. But in this video, I'm going to argue that this is a modern misconception and that the evidence doesn't support the idea. I need to make this very clear though. When I say I don't believe runes were magical sigils, I'm not saying there was no connection to magic whatsoever. There's a difference between a symbol by itself having magical power and runes being letters which can write out magical words in a magical incantation. So I do believe there was a link between runes and magic, but through the runes' ability to write magical words, not through runes being individual symbols with individual magical powers outside of the context of magical incantations. Here's an example of what I mean from English tradition. So Bede, I think most people know Bede, but Bede wrote this here in Latin, and this was translated into Old English at least twice, and here are modern English translations of the Old English translations. So the context here is Bede was recounting a story about a man who gets captured, but his binds keep falling off. So his captors ask him if he's using runes to break his binds. Notice it's in the plural. They don't ask if he used the singular magical rune sigil to break his binds. They're asking if he used letters, staves, runes, rune staves. It's in the plural. They're all in the plural. The implication here to me is that they're really asking him if he wrote out a magical incantation. From Norse tradition, we see the same thing. There's this story, Sigurdrifumal, and in the story there's a man and he's talking to a Valkyrie, and the Valkyrie tells him about these runes he can use to magical effect, but it's in the plural. She talks about things like game runes, victory runes, these bjarchrunar, but she doesn't say, hey, use the one game rune to this magical effect. It's always in the plural. And over here, there is this runic artifact that was uncovered where the man seems to be writing out a magical incantation, and he actually seems to call the runes in the magical incantation Bjarchrunar, the same Bjarchrunar over here. So the takeaway here is that if you want to know what a Bjarchrune looked like, it probably wasn't just some singular rune, but rather it was any rune which makes up a protection incantation. Now, I keep saying incantation, but a better word might actually be gahl-dohr, and here's an example of that from English. There is something called the 9 Herbs Charm, which is an example of an incantation of sorts, and after the incantation is listed in this old manuscript, there are instructions that follow. Sing that gahl-dohr. So this is noteworthy because this shows that you can write gahl-dohr using Latin letters, or at least the English believed so. So the idea that the runes were the things with the magic isn't supported here either. It seems that they could be any letters, any writing system apparently could be used to write gahl-dohr and therefore be used for magic. So yeah, the runes individually don't seem to have power here. And here is a story some people will use, and they try to use this as, you know, an argument for the whole rune sigil thing, but it's actually evidence in the other direction. So, for example, in context here, there's this guy who is served a poisoned drink, and what he does is he takes the drinking horn and he chooses wise words to carve on the horn in runes, but notice it's wise words. It doesn't say wise runes or wise sigils. So apparently he, in this story, is writing an incantation. And later on, at least I think it's later on, but somewhere else in the story, the same man learns about some like farm girl who's sick or something. And what he finds out is that someone had carved an incantation for her, but they had apparently spelled it wrong, and that caused her to get sick. And so what he does is he reads the runes, which it says here. He actually reads them, and then he ends up cutting the runes off. And yeah, so that is apparently supposed to stop the incantation from malfunctioning. And then he goes on to say that people shouldn't write runes if they don't know how to read them. So notice the word read here. He doesn't say, people shouldn't write the rune sigils if they don't know which ones have the right power. He doesn't speak about it like that. He speaks about runes as if they write out words. Something noteworthy and evidence for my argument is that all of these Norse runes I've been talking about, these were all Younger Futhark runes. And before Younger Futhark runes came to be, there were Elder Futhark runes. And there was a transition from Elder Futhark to Younger Futhark wherein 8 runes ended up being dropped from Norse tradition. And we can tell which ones were dropped first. So these 3 got dropped first. We stopped seeing them in Norse inscriptions earlier, and then later these following ones get dropped. And so the implication here, if you know about these runes, you know about their redundancy. For example, this rune, we've never found it in Elder Futhark making a sound which another rune couldn't make, so a lot of people believe it was obsolete even in our earliest inscriptions. Some people believe it used to stand for a vowel in Proto-Germanic, which got lost. So this rune gets dropped. This rune gets dropped early as well because the P sound in Germanic languages wasn't very common. So apparently people found it easier to just start using the B rune because the sound hardly ever pops up. And, it's kind of like the word cupboard. If you look at the word, it is spelled cup, but we pronounce it with a B because these two sounds sometimes will flop back and forth depending on which one's easier to say. Well, basically the Norse seem to have found the distinction between the B sound and the P sound to be so unimportant that they could easily just drop the P rune from their writing, and they did. And meanwhile, the kind of NG rune, they started writing this more commonly with literally an N rune followed by a G rune. So these 3 runes get dropped, almost certainly for spelling reasons, and then this may have triggered a kind of simplification of the Norse runic alphabet, let's call it. But the point I'm getting at is if these were magical sigils with like deep, symbolic, religious significance, then why on earth are they being dropped? And why are they being dropped for very mundane spelling reasons? So where does this idea come from that runes were magical sigils? Well, it seems to trace back to modern times and the fact that the runes all have names. It seems that modern people saw these names of the runes and then started drawing wild conclusions based on the fact that the runes had names. But the evidence doesn't indicate that the names of the runes were particularly important to the people using runes. Modern people act like the names of the runes were very important, but I have 3 arguments to go against that. The first is the evidence that the names of the runes would shift around. For example, in Elder Futhark they had this Z rune, but in English tradition we only see it being used as an X, and that is not a natural development. There's no way you're going to get the Proto-Germanic Z sound turning into an English X kind of sound. So what probably happened is they repurposed it after it became obsolete because English didn't have a need for a Z rune, and they probably didn't even remember that it ever was a Z rune because of sound changes that would have covered up the history of this rune. So they probably had this rune lying around with no useful purpose, and it could be under the influence of Latin that they decided that they wanted to repurpose it as an X, basically. And so in English manuscripts, we see this rune given the name something like Elchs. So it has this kind of X sound in its name, and that almost certainly wasn't there originally. So this rune, whatever its name was originally, it seems to have been either tweaked or completely changed to a new name containing the X sound. So what I'm getting at is they wanted to repurpose this rune to give it a more useful purpose, and so they changed its name afterwards. So here's an example of spelling coming first, and then the name of the rune coming second. Now, even though it seems that the names of the runes were pretty conservative, they don't seem to have shifted a whole bunch, there's evidence that even when a rune kept its name, that the meaning of that name could shift. The second rune, ur, is a good example of this. So in Norwegian, Icelandic, and English, these three languages agree that the name of this rune was ur, but they tell you that it means different things. In the Norwegian rune poem, it says that ur means dross. In the Icelandic rune poem, it says that ur means shower. And in the English rune poem, it says that ur means aurochs. So what seems to have happened here is that ur was probably the original name which these three languages all inherited, but because it doesn't really matter what ur means, so long as ur has the u sound in it, so you know what sound the rune makes, people were free to apply different meanings to this rune. So yeah, the evidence here isn't that ur was some sort of like deep symbolic thing that was connected to the rune. It seems to just be a way to remember what sound the rune makes. There are known cases of runes standing for concepts. For example, you can find the Norse using the M rune to stand for the word man. But I would argue that this isn't a deep symbolic thing, but rather it's shorthand. Because while the Norse may use their M rune to stand for the word man, you can find the English using their M rune to stand for the sound man. So for example, this word here is farman, and the man here doesn't mean man. This rune is just being used as shorthand for the sound man, so that they can write out farman. So what I'm getting at is, it's kind of like, imagine if we found people saying something like, a bee stung me. We might see the letter B and be like, oh, that must be their symbol for the concept of a bee. But if later on we find someone write be happy, well then we can go, oh, maybe this isn't really their symbol for bee, but rather they're using it as shorthand for the word bee because the name of the letter is B. Sometimes people will point to undeciphered runic inscriptions and declare that they must be magical. In fact, a lot of this idea that runes are magical seems to have come from this kind of lazy explanation for undeciphered inscriptions. But that doesn't make any sense. You can't look at something which we haven't deciphered and then say, because we don't know what it means, you therefore know what it means. That doesn't make any sense, especially when there are other explanations besides runes being magical sigils. So for example, how do you know that it's not just pseudo-writing? We know that people liked to use writing as decoration. So on the outside of this coin, for example, we have fake Arabic. There were coins from the Arab world which had Arab writing on it, and people in Europe apparently thought that was kind of fancy. So they mimicked it, even though they weren't actually writing anything in Arabic, but it increased the prestige of a coin to have fake Arabic written on it. And there seems to be something kind of like that going on in this coin. No one has made any sense of this. It seems to just be gibberish, so some people have proposed that it's just there for decoration. Here's another thing. How do we know that a runic inscription doesn't have abbreviations in it? So imagine that farman thing I already mentioned. Imagine if that manuscript were in a fire and the far segment got burned, leaving a lone rune. If we were to look at this lone rune and say it must be like a magical sigil or a logogram standing for the concept of man, then we would be wrong. So this is a reason why we can't just assume what a rune means. We need to figure out what it means before we can declare what it means. We can't just keep going back to the lazy explanation of magic, which is what runologists have unfortunately done for a long time, but they've realized their mistake and they don't really do that anymore. And here is another reason we can't assume that runes were supposed to be magical just because we don't understand them. People liked to do rune ciphers where they would mix up runes in weird ways and write them like that and write them like this, and it would make it really confusing, but sometimes we've been able to figure out the meaning behind these ciphers, even though people love to rush to the conclusion that it's supposed to be some sort of magical sigil, whatever. So for example, we found ciphers kind of like this, where what's going on is this person who wrote these runes out was apparently writing 3 words, but they wrote them in a ciphered way where you're supposed to notice that there are 3 thorn runes, 3 M runes, 3 K runes, followed by istel, and then you're supposed to say, like, oh, I'm supposed to read this out as thistle, mistel, kistel, and then you get something which actually makes sense. But yeah, people see stuff like this and then they just go like, well, that can't be a word, therefore it must be a magical sigil row. Here is all of the counter evidence to my argument which I've ever been able to find. In Sigurd Drifumal, that same Valkyrie who gave that man magical rune advice, does seem to say that he can mark the N rune on his nails and that that is supposed to have some kind of magical effect. In the same work, this Valkyrie tells the man that he can carve victory runes on his weapon, and then afterwards he can name the god Tur twice. So this seems to be saying that he should invoke this god twice after he's done carving these runes. Now, whether or not she means he should carve his name or invoke this god on the sword itself, or literally just speak out his name twice after he's done carving, I don't know. Something to take note of is that we have found sword pommels which might have the T rune on it. This one's really hard to see here, but there seems to be a T there. I would say that these actually look more like depictions of spearheads to me, but let's go ahead and assume that these are actually supposed to be T runes. Well, in that case, this would correspond to this line here, because this is the same sword pommel and this supposed T rune is on both sides of it, so maybe there really was some kind of Germanic thing where people would invoke this god on their sword or other weapon twice, and that maybe that was supposed to have the god favor you in battle or something like that. But this is very shallow evidence, and let's go ahead and just assume. Let's just assume that this really is what's going on and what we're seeing on these pommels. Even in this case, I would argue that this isn't necessarily a magical sigil, because in this case, it's not the rune that is supposed to be magical. It's like the god has power and you're kind of invoking him. So it would be kind of like a Christian who's in trouble carving Alpha and Omega because he's hoping that Jesus will take note and then help him out, right? That doesn't mean that this Christian believes that Greek letters are magical sigils. The third scrap of evidence comes from Skirnismal. In the story, there's a man coercing a woman, and he threatens to carve 3 staves. And the word staff here probably refers to letters. And these 3 letters seem to have negative effects that will somehow accompany their carving. Now over here, I've written the rune Thurs, but in the context of the story, it doesn't seem clear if he's actually referring to the rune or if he's calling the woman a Thurs, because it seems like she could qualify as belonging to that race of mythological creatures. Originally, my video ended on the last slide, but there's this other argument I should address because I keep seeing it thrown around, and that is this etymological argument. It goes something like this. Because runes were called rune in the first place, and because the word rune in old Germanic languages like Old English, Old Norse, and Gothic meant something along the lines of secret, mystery, hidden speech, hidden counsel, and so on, that this is evidence that runes were seen as being inherently magical or as being like magical sigils or something like that. I think the flaw in this reasoning is very obvious, but I guess I have to point it out anyways. The flaw is that this is a modern perspective. To look at letters and say these are too mundane to be given this really cool name having to do with mysteries and secrets and whatnot, that's a modern thing. Just because you think letters are mundane doesn't mean that an ancient bog person thought that letters were mundane, especially if they had never come across them before. Imagine you're a 40-year-old person who has been living in what's now Denmark your whole life, and some men show up in your village and they have these bits of wood, maybe bone, maybe metal, which have these strange markings on them, and somehow, without speaking to each other, these men are able to look at these markings and draw the same messages from them. To you, that would probably look very much like a rune, very much like a secret, very much like a mystery, very much like hidden counsel, secret counsel, and all of that. I think the name rune very much applies to a quote-unquote mundane letter.